Let's take a look now at another plan for black in the symmetrical English, and that is to try and play a Maroxy bind with colours reversed. And I'll show you first of all what I mean by the Maroxy bind. After e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, g6. White can play this move c4, and then if bishop g7, he usually goes bishop e3, but he can also play knight c2. Now, if we look at the game we've got in this section, Sarkis against Tukmakov, then after c4, c5, knight c3, knight f6, g3, d5, c takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop g2, knight c7, we have basically the same thing, and you know, if black has the chance, he's going to play e5 and try and get a Maroxy bind with colours reversed. Now, as to a question of move order, Sarkis here played the move 2 knight c3. Our recommended official move order is to play g3, and then after knight f6, bishop g2, d5, c takes d5, knight takes d5, knight c3, knight c7, we transpose back into the game. Now, given the ambitious nature of black's plan, I don't think it's good for white to play too quietly against the Maroxy bind. One possible plan that I think is very reasonable is to play here knight f3, and then after knight c6 to play the move a3 and try and blast the position open with b4. But given that white doesn't need to play knight f3, I think a better idea is this move queen b3. And essentially it forces black to accept some pawn weaknesses. I mean, he can play knight d7 in this position, with the idea of meeting bishop takes b7 with rook b8. But d7 is quite a passive place for the knight, and we'll see how to play against that in the next section. After queen b3, the main move for black is knight c6, and then white really must take this knight off if he's going to justify his play. He must inflict these weaknesses with bishop takes c6 check, otherwise queen b3 doesn't make any sense. Now, the position we get here is one that I think is quite promising for white, but quite complex strategically. He's given up the two bishops, and in return he's inflicted a lot of weaknesses in black's position. You know, these pawns on the queen side are very, very weak. He can try and build up on this pawn on c5 by going, say, d3 and bishop e3 and rook c1, but black will probably be able to meet that by going knight e6 and even knight d4. And then we often see white take the knight off with the bishop. Now, Sarkis' next move is probably the best idea, queen a4. I think a very reasonable alternative for white here is to play knight f3. And I played this myself against Adrian Michalczysin in a tournament in Lisbon in 1986. And that game continued as follows. Black played the move f6. I played d3. Black played e5. I went bishop e3. And black now played the move knight e6, and I played rook c1, and he played knight d4. I took it off, pawn takes, I played knight e4, so black straightened out his pawns, but he's way behind in development here. He played now the move bishop d7, protecting this pawn on c6, and I castled, and here he played the move rook to b8. I offered this b2 pawn with queen a4. I think that if black takes it, it would be very risky for him because white could then occupy the b file and have a means of penetrating black's position. So he didn't take the pawn and instead continued getting his pieces out. He went queen c7 to protect a7. And then I played knight fd2. He played bishop e7. I went knight b3, and now black played rook b4. And in this position I got offered a draw, and being a young and perhaps somewhat cowardly player, I accepted the draw. But in retrospect, I think that probably white should play on in this position. I think that it's an attractive position for white with his knights ready to come into c5, and I would certainly prefer to play white. Given a choice, between playing this position with white and black, then I'd want to play it with white, and I think I should have continued the game. Anyway, back to the main game. And Sarkis played Queen A4, hitting this pawn on C6. Tutmakov defended with Queen D7. So his idea is perhaps to play Knight B5 at some point. White went Knight F3. And now the immediate Knight B5 was actually played in a game. Black went F6. Knight B5 was played in a game between Larsen and John van der Wiel in Amsterdam in 1980. And that game was very interesting, in fact. I'll show you a few moves from it. White, after knight to b5, played d3. Black played f6, preparing e5. White then played bishop e3. e5 happened. White went rook c1. And then black played knight d4. White played knight e4. Black went rook b8. And now white took on c5, bishop takes c5, rook takes c5, and after rook takes b2, played a sensational move, bishop takes d4. Well, this is the start of a remarkable attack. I mean, he's giving up this rook on h1 first of all. After rook b1 check, king d2, rook takes h1. The idea was that he's going to sacrifice another piece with knight takes e5. So after fe, rook takes e5 check, then he's a whole rook down. But in fact, he's got more than enough compensation for this. I mean, the game went on king d8, bishop to c5, threatening queen h4 check, followed by rook e7. Van der Wiel played rook takes h2, really to stop queen h4 check, and then Larsen played his bishop back to b4 with the idea of bishop a5 check, and the game went bishop b7, queen takes a7, with a tremendous attack for the sacrifice rook, and in fact white went on to win this game pretty quickly. I don't think we can get embroiled in all the complications, because it was a very sharp and interesting game. But it certainly gives a taster of the dynamic possibilities for white in this kind of position, when black is lagging behind in development and playing for structural things with queen d7, bringing his knight round to d4. I mean, black has still got to bring his bishop out, his rook out, he's still got to get his king to safety, and this game, Larsen against van der Wiel, really illustrates the dangers for black. So I think knight b5 is using a lot of time, and this is probably why black is better advised just to play f6, in fact, as Tutmakov played. And then Sarkis proceeded with the move d3. Black played e5, and now white played bishop e3, and black played his knight to e6. Now, another possibility instead of bishop e3 is castles. I mean, white does have alternatives in this variation. Same kind of play would result. For example, after bishop e7, bishop e3, then white would want to play knight e4 and to bring a rook to c1, but black then could perhaps consider going knight into d5, and then if knight e4 he might take the bishop on e3, which is slightly different. I mean, white now also has doubled pawns, but he's done a lot to improve his position in other ways. I mean, I think that the white double pawns are nowhere near as serious as these that black has. I think white would once again be better in this kind of position, and so castles represents a very real alternative. Anyway, back to the game. Bishop e3 was played, and now black went knight e6, so he's protecting this pawn on c5, much as Mikkel Chisin did in the game against me. White castled, black played rook b8, and white now played rook a b1, protecting this this pawn on b2, which is a pretty reasonable way to play. And there have been a few games played by white with this move, rook a b1. Now, in the game, then Tutmakov played this very sharp and risky move h5, still with very few pieces developed. Then he's trying to attack white's king. You know, I think this is a really risky way to play it, and black has played other moves instead of this. I'm going to show you these alternatives. I mean, one of them is bishop e7, and this was played by a much more solid player, Lajos Portish from Mar del Plata in 1981. But even so, the position started to look quite nice for white after rook fc1, castles, knight e4, and now black played rook b5, and at this point probably white should have dropped his queen back to c2 with the idea of hitting the rook on b5 with a4 and causing this pawn on c5 some problems. I think that would have been better for white, and it was quite a good opportunity for Quintaros to get the advantage against Portish. Now, one other possibility after rook a b1 is to go knight d4. We saw this in my game against Mikkel Chisin. And a game now between Dorfman and Zwick from Polonitsa Zroy in 1978 continued with bishop takes d4, cd, knight to e4. Black went c5, so he's trying to deprive white of the c5 square by occupying it himself. But now white exchanged queens. Queen takes d7 check. Bishop takes d7. He went rook after c1, so he's hitting this pawn on c5. Black defended it with rook to b5. White played knight after d2, and black went bishop e6. Now white played a4, rook came to a5, and white here played knight to c4. And the idea behind this move is that rook takes a4 can be met by b3, followed by white bringing his rook to a1 and coming in on the a file. So Zwick didn't take on a4. Instead of this, he played his rook back to a6, and then Dorfman played knight a3, and then he took an a4. Even so, white was slightly better here. He now played rook takes c5, and this has got the point that bishop takes c5, knight takes c5, wins back the exchange. And in fact, after bishop d7, knight takes a4, bishop takes a4, knight c4, white is slightly better because this pawn on a7 is weak, and white's going to play rook a1 next move. So those are alternatives to the very aggressive move h5 that Tutmakov chose, and I think in fact they're better alternatives. Probably knight d4 is relatively best, but still white has some advantage in this line, and I don't really know of a clear way for black to equalise. So rook a b1, h5 was played in the game, and now Sarkis played knight e4, just proceeding with his usual plan, ignoring what's going on the king's side with this h-pawn advance. Black played knight d4. If he'd have gone h4, then I think white just takes it off. Nothing to worry about on the king's side. Black doesn't have any pieces developed. A pawn is a pawn. So knight e4, knight d4. White took the knight off, bishop takes d4, cd, and now played rook fc1, attacking the pawn on c6. Okay, black played rook to b5. Now rook c2, just building up methodically. Black played a5, rook b to c1, bishop b7. So black is still holding on to his weaknesses now, but now Sarkis played a very good move. He started to play on the other side of the board with black tied down to his queenside weaknesses, and went knight h4. And suddenly this h5 move looks... we see the dark side behind this move, because the g6 square is weakened and white wants to come in with knight g6. Okay, well, black played rook h6 here. Very funny looking move, but it's difficult to see how else he's going to defend himself. White played b3, and then black went queen d5. He could perhaps have considered the move g5 here. Would have been an interesting alternative. And then white could play knight f5, with the idea that queen takes f5 is met by rook takes c6, which would actually be very good for white. You know, I mean, the rook on b5 is skewered against the king here, and all sorts of horrible things are about to happen. But g5, knight f5, rook g6 is perhaps still playable for black, and maybe white would be better off meeting g5 by bringing his knight back to f3, and then possibly routing it round this way. So still, it's a very complicated game, even though one really must prefer white because of the many weaknesses in black's camp, and the possibility that this position is just going to explode in black's face at some moment. So after b3, black played the sensible queen d5 instead, but now Sarkis went queen c4 and transposed into an endgame. King d7, queen takes d5 check, rook takes d5, and now knight c5 check gave white the better endgame. Bishop takes c5, rook takes c5, rook to h8, trying to get the rook back into play. Knight f3, white brings his knight back into play. Rook b8, and now white played knight d2. Black goes bishop a8, so he's activating his rook a little bit along the b file. White now plays his rook back to c4, and after king c7 brings his knight into e4. So the knight may come into c5. Black plays rook b4. White goes king g2, improving his king, and after f5, white brings the knight into g5. So still a lot of black weaknesses in this position. It's clear that white is better, you know, and black's really just trying to keep him out. King d6 was played, and now white played f4, breaking up black's pawns, hitting e5. E takes f4, g takes f4, and now black played the move c5. And this allows white, in a minute, a quite remarkable combination. I mean, you've got to watch out with black, because at the moment he's threatening some, to get his bishop active. You know, his rook can perhaps come here. But there's a problem with this move, in that white moves his king away, and then when black goes back with his rook on b4, white can play knight e4 check. And the point behind this move is that after f takes e4, d takes e4, this rook on d5 is trapped. In fact, black didn't have an alternative after knight e4 check, because otherwise the c pawn would fall. So knight e4 is winning for white. Okay, f takes e4, de, rook to f7. It's all desperate stuff. White's winning now just by taking the exchange. Rook takes f4 check, king e1, rook g4, rook takes c5, bishop takes d5, rook takes a5, and after rook g1 check, king d2, rook g2, black decided to call it a day. Position's completely lost for him. So yeah, this plan with knight c7, queen b3 is a very interesting one, because after knight c6, which is I think is the best try, then black gets a lot of weaknesses inflicted on him with bishop takes c6 check. After bc, white can choose between queen a4 and knight f3. It's possible that these positions are playable for black with very exact play, but all too often the whole thing just explodes in black's face because he's behind in development and he's got a lot of weaknesses. And particularly in the game between Larsen and van der Wiel, we saw the dynamic potential of white's position unveiled.